Now, on a bit more of a serious note, we were trying to determine how you'd describe your brand of humor. How would you describe it?
Everybody knows Cheech and Chong. Say the names out loud, and most people instantly picture a cloud of smoke, a beat-up van, and two guys stumbling through a plot that barely holds together, but somehow still makes you laugh out loud. They practically invented an entire genre of comedy, and decades later, their movies still get quoted at parties and passed down like family heirlooms. But here's the thing, the version of Cheech and Chong that lives in pop culture is only the surface. Underneath the tie-dye and the punchlines is a story packed with strange coincidences, real-life drama, and career detours that most fans have never even heard about. Today we're digging into the facts that don't usually make it into the highlight reel. Stick around, because the last one on this list might be the wildest of all. Before we get into the surprises, it helps to remember just how unlikely this partnership actually was. Richard Cheech Marin grew up in South Los Angeles, the son of a police officer, and by the late 1960s, he was enrolled at a California university studying, of all things, ceramics. He wasn't chasing a stage career. He was chasing a degree. But the era had other plans. With the Vietnam War draft breathing down the neck of every young man in America, Cheech made the decision to leave the country rather than risk being shipped overseas. He landed in Vancouver, Canada, with no real plan beyond staying out of the draft board's crosshairs. Meanwhile, Tommy Chong was already living a completely different life north of the border. Born in Alberta to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Chong had spent years as a working musician, even landing a record deal with a Motown-affiliated group before pivoting away from music entirely. By the early 1970s, he'd taken over a Vancouver nightclub and turned it into something part burlesque lounge, part improv comedy stage, an unusual combination that somehow worked for the neighborhood crowd it attracted. When Cheech walked through the door looking for any job that would pay rent, nobody involved thought they were witnessing the start of a comedy dynasty. Chong needed performers for his sketch nights. Cheech needed paycheck. And the two ended up on stage together almost by accident. Their chemistry turned out to be instant and undeniable. And within a matter of months, they left the club scene behind to tour as a duo. It's a classic Hollywood-style origin story, except none of it happened in Hollywood, and none of it was planned. That backstory alone is well known among fans. What's far less known is everything that happened after the fame arrived. And that's where things get genuinely surprising. Picture this. Jason Voorhees, hockey mask and machete, stalking through the woods, only to stumble across two stoners running an illegal weed operation in the middle of nowhere. It sounds like a fan-made mashup video, but it was a real pitch that almost happened. After director Tom McLaughlin revived the Friday the 13th franchise with a well-received entry in the mid-1980s, he reportedly floated an ambitious idea to the producers. Bring Cheech and Chong into the world of Camp Crystal Lake. The concept had a couple of different versions floating around. In one, the duo would play clueless camp counselors, completely unprepared for a supernatural killer. In another, they'd be running a marijuana farm in the same woods where Jason does his hunting. Either way, the pitch leaned hard into the culture clash between slasher horror and stoner comedy, betting that audiences would love watching two mellow burnouts stumble obliviously through a nightmare. The crossover never made it past the pitch stage. Studios eventually decided against merging the two franchises, and the idea faded into industry trivia. But it's fascinating to imagine an alternate universe where Cheech and Chong got tangled up in one of horror's most iconic mythologies. It also says something about how big their cultural footprint was at the time. Studios weren't just thinking about them for stoner comedies anymore. Executives saw them as a brand flexible enough to drop into almost any genre. If you've seen Up in Smoke, you remember the license plate. The custom plate reading MUF DVR mounted on Cheech and Chong's car is one of the most quoted sight gags in the entire film, the kind of detail fans still bring up decades later. Most people assume some clever prop department dreamed it up specifically for the movie. The truth is far stranger. That plate wasn't invented for the film at all. It was a genuine vanity plate that belonged to an actual Los Angeles police officer. Someone whose day job was about as far from stoner comedy as you can get. The plate had lived a whole life before the movie ever borrowed it. having been mounted first on an unassuming American compact car, then later swapped onto a sportier vehicle, before eventually ending up on a customized Volkswagen. It stayed in active rotation for years before finally being retired in the mid-1980s. What makes the story even better is that the original owner reportedly kept the plate long after its Hollywood cameo, complete with the registration stickers still attached. So somewhere out there, an actual retired police officer has owned, for decades, one of the most recognizable comedic props in cannabis film history, probably without ever intending to become a footnote in stoner cinema. It's a kind of coincidence you couldn't invent if you tried, and it perfectly captures how much of the Cheech and Chong story was built on happy accidents rather than careful planning. Here's a story that sounds almost too painful to be funny, except that's exactly what makes it funny. According to producer Lou Adler, when Up in Smoke screened for early audiences, one attendee showed up in genuine physical pain. Actor Jack Nicholson had reportedly been in a car accident shortly before the screening and came in with a dislocated shoulder, under strict doctor's orders not to move too much, and definitely not to laugh. Naturally, that instruction didn't hold up for long. Every time the film landed a solid joke, Nicholson would let out an involuntary grunt or wince, unable to stop himself from reacting even though every laugh sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder. Adler apparently noticed something useful buried inside that discomfort. If a joke was strong enough to make someone laugh through actual physical pain, it was clearly a keeper. In a strange way, Nicholson's injury became an informal audience test, one of the most brutally honest gauges of comedic timing a filmmaker could ask for. And in a small twist connected to that same story, the rickety Volkswagen Beetle that opens a movie, the one Chong's character drives in the film's earliest scenes, wasn't just a rented prop vehicle. It reportedly belonged to Nicholson personally before it ended up on camera. So the same guy wincing through laughter in the screening room had, in an odd roundabout way, already contributed to the film before he ever sat down to watch it. You'd expect a full feature film to come with a screenplay running well past 100 pages. Not this one. For their 1981 movie Nice Dreams, reports from people involved in production described the entire script as barely stretching past 3 or 4 pages total. Not a scene-by-scene breakdown. Not detailed dialogue. Just a loose sketch of the premise and a handful of visual ideas to build from. The original concept reportedly had the duo playing landscapers secretly cultivating marijuana across the city, a plan that eventually morphed into something even more absurd. Selling weed out of an ice cream truck decorated with a giant painted clown face. It sounds like something dreamed up in 20 minutes, and by some accounts, it basically was. But don't mistake a short script for a lack of preparation. Despite how loose and improvised their films looked on screen, the physical comedy was reportedly mapped out with real precision. Every pratfall, every visual gag, every bit of slapstick timing was planned and storyboarded well in advance. The loose, hazy vibe audiences loved wasn't the result of winging it. It was a carefully built illusion of chaos. That contradiction is part of what made their comedy so effective. It felt spontaneous because they'd worked hard to make spontaneity look effortless. For years, fans assumed Cheech and Chong were basically best friends who happened to make hilarious movies together. The real relationship was much more complicated. In his own memoir, Cheech Marin described their bond not as a close friendship, but more like a sibling relationship, built on shared history and loyalty rather than warm affection. He put it plainly, they were brothers, not best friends, capable of intense arguments one moment and flawless on-stage chemistry the next. A big source of friction was creative credit. Even though both men were officially listed as writers across their run of films together, Tommy Chong ended up directing the majority of them. For Cheech, that imbalance became a genuine sore spot over time, something he later described as deeply frustrating. In one particularly blunt on-camera exchange, Chong suggested Cheech hadn't really earned a directing credit, and Cheech shot back that he'd contributed just as much behind the camera as Chong had. It wasn't scripted banter, it was real tension spilling out in public. Things reportedly escalated further during the making of their 1981 film, A Period Cheech. Later described as the moment Chong became increasingly controlling over every creative decision, from writing to directing to final cuts. By the mid-1980s, after Chong declined to participate in a solo music project Cheech was excited about. The partnership essentially ended. Cheech went on to complete that project without him, and it became a personal success. But it also marked the end of their run together after roughly 17 years as a duo. Years later, Chong reflected on the split with more humility, admitting that the power that came with directing had gone to his head during that era. He described it as a trap many directors fall into once they start believing their own authority is beyond question. It's a surprisingly candid admission, and it reframes the whole partnership as something far more human and complicated than the laid-back stoner buddy image fans grew up with. If you think Cheech and Chong only ever played variations of the same character, their resumes tell a very different story. Cheech Marin, for instance, built a serious career in voice acting, lending his instantly recognizable voice to a mischievous hyena in a major animated Disney classic and to a lowrider car character in a wildly popular animated franchise. He also voiced a wisecracking supporting character in an early 90s animated environmental film, sharing the screen with one of the most beloved comedic actors of that era. Tommy Chong carved out his own strange little niche in animation as well, appearing as a fictionalized version of himself on a long-running adult animated series known for its irreverent humor, poking fun at his own public image in the process. Their range didn't stop at cartoons. In 2010, the pair made an unexpected appearance hosting a major professional wrestling broadcast, bringing their comedic timing into an arena that couldn't be further from their usual territory. And on a more serious note, both men eventually stepped into activism and documentary filmmaking. One particularly notable documentary followed Tommy Chong's real-life legal battle after being prosecuted for selling drug paraphernalia online, a case many viewed as a politically motivated example being made of a public figure rather than a genuine public safety concern. The film gave Chong a chance to show a far more reflective, serious side that rarely came through in his stage persona. Taken together, it's clear these two spent decades quietly proving they were never just one-note performers. They kept reinventing themselves, as voice actors, as documentary subjects, as activists, long after the smoke from their movie sets had cleared. When you strip away the stereotype, the real story of Cheech and Chong is a lot more interesting than the caricature most people carry around in their heads. It's a story about two men from completely different backgrounds who stumbled into each other by pure chance, built something genuinely groundbreaking together, fought hard enough behind the scenes to eventually split apart, and still managed to leave behind careers full of unexpected turns. From horror movie crossovers that never happened, to a police officer's license plate becoming pop culture history, to a screenplay you could read in under a minute, their legacy is packed with details most fans never hear about. So the next time someone tells you stoner comedy doesn't have any depth to it, you'll have plenty of ammunition to prove them wrong. Cheech and Chong weren't just lucky. They were talented.